I'd first like to say that out of all the conferences that I've been invited to present at, this is the one that I'm most honoured to be invited to present at, because it's a phenomenal effort, and to get all of these survivors and partners and carers and in the same room is unbelievable, and hats off to Paul and Thomas. It's actually the best meeting that I've ever been to. So I'll try and tell you a little bit about the work that I do and the findings that we have, and then sort of try and explain how I got, caught in Thomas's web and have ended up here, and somehow ended up agreeing to do a whole lot of other stuff, but it's all brilliant. And I'm also going to ask Roz to come up, and she's done some really lovely sort of more in-depth work with survivors and family members, and just to talk a little bit about the research that she's done and what she's found. So if I'm talking too quickly, or you can't understand my accent, or my stats get really boring, just give me either a like, or maybe any type of symbol, and because I'm really cognizant that it's been an incredibly long day, and I'm sort of on after afternoon tea, so. So I won't play you that again, but so yeah, just to give you a bit of background, I'm from Australia. Ambulance Victoria covers the whole of Victoria, which has about 6.4 million people. We have about 650,000 emergencies that we attend, and 6,500 of those are cardiac arrest patients. We have a three-tiered response to cardiac arrest, so fire first responders, advanced life support paramedics, and our mobile intensive care paramedics, but also we now dispatch lay responders through Good Sam, which some of you may have heard of. If you haven't heard of Good Sam, get behind it, get all of your friends behind it. Mark Wilson, who started that, who's a neurologist who works for the Sydney HEMS, the London HEMS as well. I said to one of my colleagues recently, he is a saint, and my colleague said he's Jesus. So if you want to see the good work that he's doing in terms of trying to create a community response to cardiac arrest, look up Good Sam. So why I'm sort of here and part of the journey is that 20 years ago I established the Victorian Ambulance Cardiac Arrest Registry. So we collect data on every single cardiac arrest that the paramedics go to across the state. We now have data on over 110,000 patients. And it's one of the few cardiac arrest registries in the world to actually collect patient-reported outcome measures, so to collect data beyond survival to hospital. And it's got a lot of reporting to government, and I won't bore you with some of the ways that you can get your research funded by getting your KPIs in your agreement with the health minister, but there's a whole lot of ways that I've sort of managed to keep this registry going for 20 years. And so what we do, as well as sort of collecting all the paramedic data and the hospital data, at 12 months we contact all adult survivors. So we check to make sure that there hasn't been a death in the 12 months as much as possible with the death registry. And also we don't do a sort of a blind call. So what we do is we send letters out to survivors to warn them that in the next few weeks they're likely to receive a phone call and asking them about basically how they're doing. And I know, I don't actually send those letters out, but those letters have my name on it. And I know when a batch has gone out because I get inundated with phone calls from survivors just making sure we've got the right phone number, or making sure that, telling me they're not available on a Monday. So the response in general is that cardiac arrest survivors really want to talk about this and really want to talk about how they're doing, and they don't see it as invasive, and they're really happy that someone is asking these questions. And from my perspective, the reason why we implemented this in 2010 is that we can be doing a great job as an ambulance service and sort of saying we're getting all these survivors, but if they're not returning to a good quality of life and good functioning outcome, we're actually not doing a great job, and we need to look at why we're not doing a great job, and we need to do better. So I'll just give you an overview of some of the data that we've got from the registry, which shows the patient outcomes. So this is just showing sort of the demographics of the patients that we see. And you can see our female cardiac arrest patients tend to be a little bit older, and that just reflects that our females tend to be older in the population. But what I find really interesting is there's a really big bucket of cardiac arrest patients that are actually in the younger age group. So it's not the sort of the old, problem that people sort of try and say. This is young, engaged, Charlotte people that are having sudden cardiac arrest as well. So it's a really significant health problem and something that hasn't had the investment. I mean, the amount of money that's invested in cancer is phenomenal, but if you look at the incidence of cardiac arrests per 1,000 population, the dollars invested in it are nothing near the dollars that are invested in something like cancer. So we need to be advocating as a group, and we need to be making sure that we do much more about this. And you are so powerful in being able to help in that area. So what we see, and you're probably all familiar with this, but this is what we see in Victoria, is about 32% of our patients who are in a shockable rhythm, so can be shocked by a defibrillator, survive to hospital discharge. So this is where, if we get more engagement with the community and get community defibrillators, when a patient in Victoria is defibrillated by a community member with a public accessible defibrillator, their survival is around the 70% mark. So, but when they're defibrillated by having to wait till paramedics get there, it's more around the sort of 25% mark. So getting defibrillators out into the community is one of the best things that you can do for patients in cardiac arrest. Obviously, patients who are found in non-shockable rhythms don't do as well, but we have some fantastic survivors from that cohort as well. So mainly how Thomas and I got sort of talking is the quality of life data that we collect through our registry. So again, I just thought I'd give you a bit of a snapshot at what we see, and then also Ros will sort of talk. You've got your data, haven't you, Ros? You're okay to do that? Yeah. So this is a snapshot from 5 years worth of cardiac arrest patients. So we had 30,000 cardiac arrests in our registry, of which paramedics attempted resuscitation in 14,000. So there are some patients that we get to that the resuscitation attempt would be futile. So, they've been in arrest for like over half an hour. The rhythm is not compatible with life and things like that. So then we have about 13% discharged alive, and almost the same amount are alive at 12 months. So again, this is a conversation I have with a lot of ED doctors and quite a number of cardiologists, unfortunately, about that. Because they often say that's not worth resuscitating these patients, which is a horrible thing to say, but I can always show great data that the good survival at 12 months and reasonable quality of life outcomes, but again, talking about what we need to do in that space to get better. So of our responders, we have a follow-up rate of about 82-84%. So some are lost to follow-up, they move interstate, or we don't have the right address, but generally people want to be followed up. I actually had a letter from a lady in prison who had got my letter about follow-up and was contacting me to say that she wanted to work out how she could do the phone call. So, it's people are pretty enthusiastic. So I won't bore you with the kind of technical details, but we basically use a number of validated quality of life tools. So the Glasgow Outcome Scale, which is really about how sort of functional outcomes as opposed to quality of life. We use what's called the EuroQual 5, which is a European quality of life tool. And the reason why we use validated tools is because you can look at the age and gender peers in the community and compare them with cardiac arrest survivors, and so you can have, you can see whether they're doing better or worse, and then there's, there's data for research to show where you should be investing. And we do the 12-item short form health survey. So, and we also ask some questions about their residential status. Are you living back at home? Are you living at home without care? And for patients who were working at the time of their arrest, we ask them about whether they've returned to work. And I actually had a really bright paramedic do a research project with me recently, and he's just had his article accepted in a journal called Resuscitation, and he did a much more in-depth look at the return to work question, and was asking questions about, if you didn't return, was it because your employer wasn't supportive, or whether they didn't give you any flexible arrangements. And we did find that in particular, and not surprising, the more labour-intensive jobs, patients were much less likely to return to work than the sort of the more desk type jobs. Yeah, so if I give you just a little bit of information according to age group, so you can see, not surprisingly, survival declines as patients age, and that's not surprising. And we also see an increase of our quality of life questions being answered by partners or carers, and not being able to be answered by the patient themselves. So if we look at the EQ5D, you can group. They ask questions about how well a patient's mobility is, and you can group it into sort of no problems, some problems, and extreme problems. So if you look at the EQ5D, it actually looks like most patients, particularly in the younger age group, report no problems. And as you get a little bit older, some problems, and then not surprisingly over 66, more problems. But compared to your age and gender peers, that wouldn't be surprising. And similar for activity. So your younger patients more likely to sort of say no problems with activity, but that sort of decreases as patients get older. But again, sort of to highlight that you still have a significant amount of patients in the groups that are saying they do have some problems. And I'll talk a little bit about this tool because I think it's not the best tool. Self-care. Most patients say their self-care is fine, and this is pretty consistent across all the age groups. And pain, I guess this is a surprising one, and I really liked that the example. Who gave the example about the biggest problem was this person's pain, and so focusing on what you can do about that then means that you can actually get some results rather than having to just sort of do a blunt sort of rehabilitation tool. Anxiety, not surprising, sort of over a quarter of patients in most groups presenting some anxiety, and this is at 12 months post-arrest. And when we come to the SF12, you can create summary scores from that. So you can create a mental summary score and a physical summary score. And the way we look at that, and sorry, this is a little bit researchy, but we look at how different the group is, the cardiac arrest survivor group is, from their age and gender norms in the population. So what we see is the younger patients are actually showing significantly reduced or compromised mental scores compared to their peers, but the 46 to 65 and the over 66 actually report better mental scores than and this goes to show the bluntness of some of these tools, but to some degree talking to these patients is the lucky to be alive kind of concept, but again the tools can be a bit blunt. And for the physical, we see again the younger patients reporting worse physical outcomes than their age and gender peers, and that also is seen in the 46 to 65 year olds, and the older population reporting better outcomes. So blunt tools, but it gives us a snapshot of where people are. And what we see overall of the patients that were working prior to their arrest, 77% have returned to work at 12 months. Not all of those full time and not all of those in the same role, but it's a really comforting result, I think. So, and not surprising, you see that decline as patients age. And we also just had a recent study done by one of my staff members looking at quality of life outcomes in males versus females, and there was a striking worse outcomes in females than males. So this is the percentage of responders with any problem according to our EQ5D, and you can see the females in mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain and anxiety and depression all report worse outcomes. So, and we don't know why that is, but we really need to look into why that is and really need to do something about it. So without this data, it's very hard to advocate, and it's very hard to get research to explore what we can do about this and what's driving it. So I've talked about the tools that we use, and they're all validated, and they're generic quality of life tools, but are they appropriate? Well, they're generic and they're blunt, and do they address the questions that's important to survivors? Probably not all of them. And can we combine answers from partners and patients? And we really need, and lots of different registries and trials use all different outcomes. So being able to compare across studies is really difficult, and that really compromises how these results can be translated into proper changes to help patients. So we really need more research in this area. And we have done some research where we've compared quality of life tools, and we've shown that they're actually not great in the cardiac arrest survivor population. So did you want to talk, Ros, a little bit now about some of your findings, and then how am I going for time? Because I could talk forever, which is...
Another 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to do it, or will we wait till the survivor moderator group? Wait for that.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so this is where we get to quite a common theme that I think you've heard throughout this session today, is that there's significant gaps with cardiac arrest survivors. So patients are routinely not offered rehabilitation. Other conditions have really strong evidence-based pathways. Cardiac arrest doesn't. Why is that? Why isn't that being invested in? There's a lack of understanding on the impact on family and survivors. There's no standardised approach to discharge care, which Thomas is trying to address with a model that could be scaled up to sort of gold standard or to bare minimum. And the focus has been on survival for decades, and we're getting more and more survivors. If you see the survival trajectory in Ambulance Victoria, it's significant, but unless we do, it's our responsibility to do something to make sure survivors have the best quality of care that they possibly can, and we're really not doing that at the moment. And the patient-reported outcome measures really aren't working in this population, and they're really blunt when you can be asked questions like, do you have fatigue? Or severe fatigue is one of the questions in one of the fatigue scales. Now, patients may not have, they may have fatigue every day, but they don't have severe fatigue, so they answer no, and then people will say, well, that's not an issue in this population, and that's so not true. So Thomas mentioned, he put this slide up as well, and it just highlights that for something like stroke, in order to get nice guidelines published on rehabilitation, there's a huge amount of money being invested in research, a huge amount of research that's been done, and then evidence-based guidelines have been published. We don't have anything like that in cardiac arrest, and we need to be advocating and saying, why the hell don't we? And this is where you could really help. So what are we going to do? So this is Rosalind presenting her amazing work in Lund, and that's what Thomas said, that we actually met in Lund, which was a conference earlier this year, and we were talking and just saying, this is just not on, we have a responsibility, and we've got a group of interested researchers all sort of doing little bits around the world, but we need to pool our efforts and collaborate and coordinate what we're doing and really get something solid and manage to get funding and get some proper results in this cohort. So I met with Thomas earlier this year in London when I was there for another conference, and with Ros as well, with the idea that we're not waiting for someone to give us approval or invite us to do something. We've established an international task force on cardiac arrest recovery with the mission to improve the health and well-being of cardiac arrest patients and their families, increasing access and evidence for multidisciplinary interventions via a bespoke cardiac arrest recovery team. And there'll be a whole body of work. There's obviously Thomas's great work around what cardiac arrest rehabilitation should look like, but we'll also plan to start an international body of work on patient-reported outcome measures for cardiac arrest survivors and what is important to them, and what is meaningful and reproducible, and how that can be then used to measure patients across populations and really look to see where there's gaps and advocate for what we should be doing to improve that. So we have a number of key outputs all around sort of getting rehabilitation and measurement of outcomes and rehabilitation on the agenda. So we're pulling together a really diverse and experienced group of people across numerous countries, so cardiologists, psychologists, epidemiologists, rehabilitation specialists, to really try and make sure we have a coordinated approach and use it as a tool to advocate for cardiac arrest survivors and really ask those questions about why isn't this on the agenda, and ultimately to end up with evidence-based strategies that are really going to help patients and families. So that's Thomas's. I think he's talked about that, and this is all the different places at the moment that we've got people who have agreed to be on this task force and start this collaboration. So hopefully I didn't talk too quickly. I always have so much that I want to say in a short period of time, but again, I'm so honoured to be here, and it's so lovely to see you and hoping to meet some of you in more sort of detail at the drinks. This is our CEO, Tony Walker, who I have to say is incredibly supportive of improving outcomes for cardiac arrest patients, and one of our young survivors from last year who had CPR and defibrillation by workmates. So again, sorry if I've spoken quickly in my weird accent, but yeah, real honour to be here and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.